Story 1. When I was 5 years old, I had one single possession that mattered more to anything else I owned. It wasn't a blanket or a toy truck. It was my stuffed animal, a small white dog with floppy ears, black button eyes, and fur that had become soft and worn from years of hugging it every night. I took that dog everywhere with me. It slept in my arms. It went on car rides. It came on every trip. To me, it wasn't a toy. It was my best friend. One day my family was traveling through the Miami airport. The place was loud, crowded, and full of people rushing in every direction. At some point in all the chaos, my stuffed dog disappeared. I don't even remember how it happened. Maybe it slipped out of my backpack. Maybe I dropped it while walking. All I knew was that suddenly, it wasn't there anymore. I panicked. I started crying immediately. I remember begging my parents to help me find it. But the airport was huge and we had a flight to catch. There was no time to search. We had to leave without it, and I was completely devastated. I cried for hours, and even after we got home, I kept hoping somehow it would magically come back. A few weeks later, my mom came into my room holding a stuffed dog. It looked exactly like mine. Same size, same floppy ears, same little face. But there was one big difference. It was brown instead of white. She told me that airport workers had found my original stuffed dog and mailed it back to us. The only reason it looked different, she explained, was because it had been sitting in sunny Florida for so long that it had gotten a tan. To my 5-year-old brain, that explanation made perfect sense. I didn't question it for a second. I hugged that dog like it had gone on a long adventure and finally made its way home. I told people about how it had been in Florida and got tanned by the sun. I believed that story for years. That same tan dog still exists today. It now belongs to my son, and just like me, he absolutely loves it. Story 2. When I was a kid, I loved watching war movies. They were intense, loud, and dramatic, but one thing always stuck with me. The death scenes looked way too real. Soldiers didn't just fall down. They screamed, twitched, and bled in a way that felt disturbingly convincing. I couldn't understand how actors could pretend to die so realistically. So one day, I asked one of my older brothers how they did it. He looked at me seriously and told me something that completely changed how I saw movies. He said they didn't use actors for those scenes at all. According to him, movie studios would go to nearby state prisons, empty them out, and bring the prisoners to the movie set. They would dress them up in military uniforms, give them real guns, and send them into battle scenes. Then he added the worst part. He said the prisoners were promised that if they survived the filming, they would be set free. I was about 7 years old when he told me that, and I believed it completely. Every war movie I watched after that felt horrifying. I thought I was watching real people fighting for their freedom on screen. I didn't realize it was all nonsense until I was around 10 years old. Story 3. When I was little, I watched a kids' TV show that featured a tap dancer. I was amazed by how fast and loud the tapping sounds were. It looked like music was coming straight from his feet. I asked my older brother how tap dancers made those sounds. He told me they didn't come from their feet at all. He said tap dancers actually made clicking noises with their mouths, using their tongues and teeth, while stomping their feet just to trick the audience. I believed him. For weeks, I practiced tap dancing by making clicking and popping noises with my mouth while stepping around the house. I thought I was learning a real skill. My mom eventually caught me and made me stop because she couldn't figure out what the hell I was doing. Story 4. When I was very young, my parents told me that if you smoked a cigarette, you would die instantly. Not later. Not from disease. Immediately. So when I saw them smoking at a campfire one night, I panicked. I cried and begged them to stop because I truly believed they were about to drop dead right in front of me. They had forgotten the lie they told me, so they were completely confused about why I was losing my mind. Story 5. When I was about 12 years old, my grandpa took me and one of my cousins into the forest. It was supposed to be a simple outdoor trip, just walking around, exploring, and enjoying nature. My cousin was 16 at the time, which meant he was old enough to enjoy messing with me and scaring me for fun. At some point, while we were walking between the trees, My cousin started telling me about a creature that supposedly lived deep in the woods. He said it wasn't an animal and it wasn't human. He described it as something unnatural, something that had both male and female body parts. According to him, it came out at night and attacked anything it could find. Animals, people, anything alive. I didn't believe him at first. It sounded ridiculous and way too extreme to be real. I laughed it off and told him he was lying. Then my grandpa chimed in. In a completely serious tone, my grandpa said, "Oh yeah, that thing is real." He added a few details of his own, nodding along like this was common knowledge. That was when everything changed. Suddenly, the forest didn't feel peaceful anymore. Every sound, the wind, the birds, the snapping of branches, felt threatening. I became convinced that something was watching us from behind the trees. I started crying and begging to go home, terrified that we were going to run into this creature. Looking back, it was a cruel joke. But at the time, it was one of the scariest moments of my childhood. Story 6. When my younger sister was about 5 years old, my mom came up with a trick to get her to stop lying. She told my sister that Benadryl wasn't just medicine, it was actually truth serum. According to my mom, if my sister took it, she wouldn't be able to lie anymore, no matter how hard she tried. Whenever my mom suspected my sister was lying, she would threaten to give her Benadryl. The moment she heard that, my sister would panic. She would immediately start confessing to whatever she had done, even if it was something small like sneaking candy or hiding a toy. I knew the whole thing was fake. I was in on the joke with my mom, which made it even funnier to watch. But for my sister, it was completely real. She genuinely believed that a spoonful of medicine would force the truth out of her. She would get so upset that she'd start crying, begging not to take it, and blurting out confessions just to avoid it. It worked way too well. Story 7. When I was 8 years old, my dad told me he was extremely colorblind. Not just a little, completely, absurdly colorblind. He said the sky looked green to him, the grass looked blue, and traffic lights were all backwards. He kept going. He told me that stop signs looked green and go lights looked red. Then he took it even further and said that people's skin colors were flipped too. White people looked black to him, and black people looked white. I believed him. I had no reason not to. One day, I asked my mom, "Mommy, do I look black to you too?" She instantly realized what my dad had told me and absolutely lost it. She was furious and made him take back the whole thing immediately. Until then, I had been completely convinced that my dad saw the world in some bizarre, upside-down way. Story 8. When I was a kid, my parents were separated, and I was staying at my dad's place. One day he and one of his friends were standing outside on the deck, drinking beer and smoking cigarettes. I was nearby, playing with my plastic ninja sword and chopping the heads off dandelions. My dad never let me have soda. It was basically forbidden. At some point, his friend left, and my dad went inside to do the dishes. That's when I saw it. A can of 7-Up sitting on the table. I sprinted for it and took a huge gulp. It wasn't soda. It was a can full of cigarette butts and old ash. I immediately ran inside and threw up. My dad rushed over asking what happened, but I lied and said nothing. Of course, he figured it out. So he told me something I believed for years. He said all soda tastes like that, even when it's unopened. I didn't touch soda again for a very long time. Story 9. When I was a kid, I noticed that all old TV shows and movies were in black and white. I honestly thought that meant the world itself used to be black and white. In my mind, people in the past didn't see color at all. So one day, I asked my dad a serious question: who invented color? He looked at me, straight-faced, and said, "Walt Disney." I believed him completely. For way longer than I should have. I honestly thought Disney had created color the same way he created cartoons. Story 10. When I was 7 years old, one of my teachers had us write letters. It could be to anyone, a friend, a family member, or someone who needed cheering up. My mom worked at the county jail, and she suggested I write to one of the inmates who never received mail. So I did. I wrote a sweet little letter saying I was sorry they were arrested and that I hoped they got out soon. I signed it with my messy 7-year-old handwriting. When it was time to put a return address on the envelope, my mom had stepped out, so I asked my older brother what our address was. He gave me 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue, Washington, D.C. That's the White House. I wrote it down and mailed it. Years later, when I went with my mom to her job, one of the corrections officers called me Mr. President. I didn't know why until he told me about the letter I had sent years earlier. It became a running joke at the jail every time my mom talked about me. Story 11. When I was in 5th grade, I was constantly told the same warning over and over again. If you sit too close to the TV or computer screen, you'll ruin your eyes and go blind. Every adult said it. Parents, teachers, relatives. It was treated like an absolute scientific fact. So every time I leaned too close to a screen, someone would shoo me away like I was playing with fire. Then, the summer after 5th grade ended, something happened that felt like proof they were right. When I started 6th grade, I found out I needed glasses. I remember sitting in the eye doctor's office, trying on my very first pair. Everything suddenly looked sharper and clearer. Instead of being sympathetic, my family immediately went into "we told you so" mode. I was reminded over and over again that this was what happened when you didn't listen. To make it even worse, they compared me to my younger sister. She was only a year younger than me, and everyone said she wouldn't need glasses because she had listened better. According to them, she didn't sit too close to the TV. She didn't stare at screens as much. So her eyes were safe. Less than a year later, she needed glasses too. Story 12. When I was a kid, I played with Barbie dolls like almost every other child. One thing about Barbie always stood out to me: her feet. They were always stuck in that pointed, tiptoe position, perfectly shaped to fit inside high heel shoes. At some point, my child brain decided that this wasn't just how Barbie was made. It was how real women eventually became. I genuinely believed that when girls grew up into women, their feet slowly changed shape until they looked like Barbies. I thought adult women's feet were permanently arched, just like they were always wearing invisible high heels. What makes this even funnier is that I lived in a house with 4 grown women. I saw their feet every day. None of them had Barbie feet. But somehow, that never clicked in my brain. Story 13. One day when I was a kid, a button fell off my shirt. I was really upset about it. I thought my shirt was ruined forever. My mom, trying to calm me down, came up with a sweet little lie. She told me that if I put the button under a rock in the backyard, the button fairy would come and replace it with a quarter. I loved that idea. So I went outside, picked a rock, and placed the button underneath. Sure enough, a quarter appeared later. To me, that meant the button fairy was real. That was all the encouragement I needed. I went back into my room and started pulling buttons off every single shirt I owned. I wanted more visits from the fairy. My mom was horrified when she realized what I had done, but it was too late. To this day, more than 40 years later, random shirt buttons can still be found under rocks in my parents' backyard. Story 14. When I was little, my parents told me that if I left a pile of rocks under a specific tree outside our house, a fairy would come visit me. I believed it completely. Every day, I would go outside, collect rocks, and carefully place them under that tree. I imagined a tiny magical creature coming by when I wasn't looking, checking my pile, and maybe even leaving something behind. The real reason my parents told me this was simple. They wanted me to go outside and play. I wasn't old enough to be left alone safely, so this gave me something to do while they watched from nearby. But in my mind, it wasn't about getting fresh air. It was about fairies. I even believed there were multiple fairies, because both my mom and my dad told me the story. To me, that meant there was an entire fairy community living in that tree. Story 15. When I was in school, the teachers told us something terrifying. If you ever pulled the fire alarm, a special kind of ink would shoot out onto your hands. The ink wouldn't wash off for days, so everyone would know who did it. They used it as a way to scare kids into never touching the alarms. And it worked. I was terrified of them. I wouldn't even stand too close, just in case. I believed that story for years. Actually, not just years, decades. I was 26 years old when I finally learned that it wasn't true. Our school's fire alarms never had any ink at all. It was just a lie told to keep kids in line. Even now, every time I see a fire alarm, a tiny part of me still expects it to spray blue ink everywhere if someone touches it. Story 16. When I was a kid, my dad was reading The Count of Monte Cristo, a huge, dramatic adventure novel. Instead of reading it quietly, he started telling it to me as a bedtime story. But he didn't say it was a book. He told it like it was something he himself had written. Every night he would sit with me and begin, "So in my story," and then describe daring escapes, secret identities, and epic revenge. I was completely hooked. The story felt magical, especially because I believed it was coming straight from my dad's imagination. Whenever he reached the part he had just finished reading, he would stop and say, "To be continued." I would whine and beg him to keep going, but he always refused, saying he needed time to write the next part. For about a week and a half, I truly believed my father was secretly one of the greatest writers who had ever lived. It wasn't until much later that I realized he was just retelling one of the most famous novels of all time. Story 17. There's a college near where I grew up whose mascot is a cougar. They also sell something called cougar gold cheese. My uncles, trying to mess with me, told me it was made from real cougar milk. That made sense to me as a kid. I just accepted that somewhere out there must be a place where people milked cougars the same way they milk cows. I never questioned it. Years later, when I was in my early 20s, I saw a can of cougar gold at the store and suddenly stopped. I actually pictured what a cougar dairy farm would look like. Angry wild cats hooked up to milking machines, trying to claw their way out. That's when it finally hit me how ridiculous it was. I had been walking around as a grown man who still believed they were milking cougars to make cheese. Story 18. When I was little, I believed leprechauns were real. Not just kind of real, completely real. I knew that if you caught one, you would get his pot of gold, so I took that mission very seriously. I spent hours designing traps. I built little boxes, rigged strings, and made elaborate setups in the hopes of catching one. I was determined. A few times, I found small gold-colored rocks in my traps. That was all the proof I needed. I thought I was getting closer. Years later, I learned the truth. My dad had been painting rocks with gold paint and sneaking them into my traps at night. It's actually one of my favorite childhood memories, even though it fell apart when I realized no other kids were trying to catch leprechauns. Story 19. When my sister and I were kids, our mom told us she was a Grammy-winning singer. She even said all her trophies were stored in the attic, knowing full well neither of us would ever go up there to check. We believed her completely. We bragged about it to friends, teachers, and anyone who would listen. For years, we thought our mom was secretly famous. Eventually, we found out the truth. She couldn't really sing at all. We've never let her live it down. So this past Christmas, my sister and I gave her a fake Grammy with her name engraved on it. She laughed so hard she cried. Story 20. When I was little, I noticed something that didn't make sense to me at all. I'm black, and my mom is dark-skinned, but my dad is extremely light-skinned, so light that he almost looks pale. Even as a small kid, I could tell the difference, and eventually I got curious enough to ask him about it. I remember looking up at him and saying something like, "Dad, why are you so much brighter than Mom?" Without missing a beat, he told me that one day, a giant bucket of white paint fell on him and that's why his skin looked that way. That was it. That was the entire explanation. And I believed him. In my mind, that story made perfect sense. I pictured my dad just walking around one day when, splash, a huge bucket of white paint fell right on him and changed his skin forever. I never questioned it. I just accepted that paint accidents were apparently powerful enough to alter someone's entire appearance. But that wasn't the only ridiculous thing my dad convinced me of. He also told me that my older sister didn't actually go to school. According to him, she climbed into a hat every morning and stayed inside it all day. So whenever I wanted to play with her, I would grab whatever beanie or hat was nearby and peer inside, trying to see if she was hiding in there. In my little mind, she was just hanging out inside a hat somewhere, waiting to come out when she got home. On top of that, I had friends who told me equally wild lies. One kid swore she used to ride dinosaurs like horses. Another said her short hair was short because it retracted into her head every day when the sun got too strong. I believed all of it. Looking back, I wasn't just gullible. I was basically a walking lie magnet. Story 21. When I was about 2 years old, my mom once told me, "You have a little Indian in you." What she meant was that I had some Native American ancestry somewhere in my family. But I didn't understand that. Around the same time, I had just seen the movie The Indian in the Cupboard, which is about a tiny little man who comes to life and lives inside a cupboard. So when my mom said I had a little Indian in me, my brain immediately took it literally. I thought there was a tiny man living inside my body. For a long time, I imagined him just hanging out in there, like a tiny roommate. I pictured him walking around inside me, maybe sitting down, maybe leaning against something, just quietly living in there. I never told anyone because I didn't think it was strange. It just felt like something I had learned. It took a while before I realized she meant ancestry, not a miniature person. Story 22. When I was a kid, I noticed that police officers were always hanging around donut shops. It seemed like every time I saw a Dunkin' Donuts or some other donut place, there was a cop inside. So I asked my dad why. He told me that police officers weren't there to eat donuts. They were there to help make them. According to him, donut shop owners needed police officers to come in and shoot the holes into the pastries to give them that classic donut shape. I believed him completely. In my head, it made total sense. I imagined cops standing behind the counter with their guns, carefully firing through lumps of dough to create perfectly round donuts. I thought it was just another part of their job. One day, when I was in a Dunkin' Donuts with my dad, I tried to sneak behind the counter because I wanted to see the shooting happen. That's when he realized he might have taken the lie a little too far. That was the moment the truth finally came out.